They said the job was cursed. 16 assistants in a single month, most left crying before their lunch break. Victor Costello was a paralyzed, ruthless crime lord who chewed people up for sport. But he never expected Juliet, a desperate, overweight single mother who absolutely refused to be broken. If you drove up the winding, frost-covered roads of the Hudson Valley in the winter of 2019, you might catch a glimpse of the Costello estate. Hidden behind wrought-iron gates and towering pines, it looked like a fortress. And in many ways it was. Inside sat Victor Costello, former undisputed king of the New York underground, now confined to a custom-built wheelchair. 2 years prior, a car bomb meant to end his life had only succeeded in severing his spine. It left him paralyzed from the waist down, steeped in chronic pain, and vibrating with a bitter, explosive rage. Victor terrified his enemies, but he terrorized his staff. Since his accident, the mansion had a revolving door of personal assistants. They were usually young, timid, and entirely unprepared for a boss who would throw hot coffee at the wall because it was brewed 2 degrees too cold. No one lasted a day. Enter Juliet Jenkins. Juliet was 28, a single mother to a severely asthmatic 6-year-old boy named Leo, and she was at the absolute end of her rope, drowning in medical debt and facing eviction from her cramped apartment in Queens. Juliet didn't have the luxury of being intimidated. She was also a big woman, fat, curvy, carrying the physical weight of her struggles alongside the emotional ones. Society often made her feel invisible, or worse, treated her as an easy target for ridicule. But motherhood had forged her spine out of titanium. When the desperate temp agency sent her to the Costello estate, the recruiter, a nervous woman named Brenda, practically begged her to just survive until 5 p.m. "If you finish out the day, it's $1,000 bonus," Brenda had whispered over the phone. $1,000 meant Leo's inhalers. It meant groceries. It meant survival. When Juliet arrived at the sprawling mansion, the heavy mahogany doors were opened by Bruno, a hulking bodyguard with a scar across his jaw. He took one look at Juliet, at her worn-out, thrift store sensible shoes, her wide hips, and the cheap, poorly fitting blazer she wore over her thick frame, and smirked. "You lost, sweetheart," Bruno grunted, leaning against the doorframe. The kitchen staff enters through the back. Juliet didn't blink. She adjusted her battered tote bag on her shoulder. "I'm the new executive assistant. Now are you going to let me freeze on the porch, or are you going to do your job and show me to Mr. Costello?" Bruno's smirk vanished. He stepped aside, muttering under his breath, and led her through the labyrinthine halls of the estate. The air inside was suffocating heavy with the smell of expensive cigars and unspoken fear. She was led into a massive, dimly lit library. Sitting behind a sprawling oak desk was Victor Costello. He was a striking man in his late 30s with sharp features and cold, hollow eyes. The moment Juliet stepped into the room, Victor didn't even look up from his ledgers. "Get out!" Victor rasped his voice like grinding stones. "I haven't even introduced myself," Juliet replied calmly, walking closer. Victor finally looked up. His eyes scanned her up and down, dripping with undisguised contempt. "I don't care who you are. You're not cut out for this. You'll be crying in your car in 20 minutes. I asked for a competent assistant, not a whatever this is. Get out before I have Bruno toss you out." To emphasize his point, Victor violently swept his arm across the desk. A heavy crystal whiskey tumbler shattered against the hardwood floor, sending shards of glass flying just inches from Juliet's cheap shoes. Silence echoed in the massive room. Victor waited for the inevitable tears. He waited for her to run. Instead, Juliet let out a long, exhausted sigh, the exact same sigh she used when her 6-year-old threw his toys at the wall. She calmly walked over to a nearby closet, retrieved a broom and dustpan, and walked back to the desk. "I'm fat, Mr. Costello, not fragile," Juliet said, her voice deadpan as she began sweeping up the glass. "And if you think a broken cup is going to scare off a woman who has wrestled a screaming toddler into a snowsuit at 6 in the morning on 3 hours of sleep, you are severely overestimating your intimidation tactics." Victor froze. For the first time in 2 years, the paralyzed Mafia boss was completely, utterly speechless. "Now," Juliet said, dumping the glass into a wastebasket and pulling out a notepad. "I need your schedule for the week, the contacts for your physical therapists, and I suggest you use your words next time you're upset. Throwing things is for children." Victor stared at her, a muscle feathering in his jaw. Slowly, a dark, dangerous smirk touched the corner of his lips. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or the stupidest." "I'm a mother with rent due," Juliet replied flatly. "What's my first task?" "Against all odds." Juliet survived the first day. Then she survived the first week. Her presence in the Costello estate was an anomaly that sent ripples through the underground syndicate. Victor was relentless, pushing her to her physical and mental limits. He would deliberately schedule meetings on the opposite ends of the massive estate, forcing Juliet to hustle her heavy frame up and down the long corridors. He would bark cruel insults about her weight, her clothes, her background. But Juliet was a fortress. When he mocked her size, she didn't shrink. "If my weight is the most interesting thing you can insult, you're losing your edge, boss," she told him one Tuesday, casually reorganizing his confidential files. "Now do you want to review the shipping manifests from the docks, or do you want to keep giving me diet advice you read in a magazine?" Slowly the dynamic began to shift. Victor's cruelty turned into a bizarre, gruff form of respect. He realized Juliet's mind was razor-sharp. Because the guards, the capos, and the rival associates dismissed her as just a fat secretary, they spoke freely around her. Juliet soaked up everything. She caught a discrepancy in the accounting that saved Victor $250,000. She organized his chaotic life with maternal precision. But as the weeks bled into a brutal February, Juliet began to notice something terrifying. Victor was declining. On the days he was scheduled for physical therapy, he was lethargic, his speech slightly slurred, his sharp eyes clouded. The estate's private nurse, a slim, arrogant woman named Clara, claimed it was just the progression of his nerve damage and prescribed heavier painkillers. Clara openly despised Juliet. She would make sneering comments in the staff kitchen, laughing at Juliet's Tupperware lunches and tight clothes. But Juliet ignored the mean girl antics. Her focus was on Victor. Having nursed her own ailing grandmother through severe illness before she passed, Juliet knew what oversedation looked like. One evening after the rest of the staff had turned in, Juliet stayed late in Victor's private study. She was supposed to be filing, but she watched him struggle to keep his head up over a chessboard. "You look terrible," Juliet noted, not mincing words. "Always a flatterer, Jenkins." Victor mumbled, rubbing his temples. "My legs. The phantom pain is worse. Clara gave me my pills an hour ago, just waiting for them to kick in." Juliet frowned. She walked over to his side table, where the little plastic cup of pills sat empty. She remembered the color of the capsules Clara usually administered. They were typically white and blue. But a faint, powdery residue at the bottom of the cup looked distinctly yellow. "Mr. Costello," Juliet said, her voice lowering. "Who handles the pharmacy pickups?" "Clara does." "Why?" Victor blinked, trying to focus on her. "Because I think you're being poisoned." Victor's head snapped up a flash of the old dangerous Mafia boss cutting through the pharmaceutical haze. "Watch your mouth, Juliet. Clara has been with me for a year. And I've been with you for a month, and I'm telling you, someone is slipping you a sedative, Juliet insisted, planting her hands on her wide hips. You're a sitting duck. You're tired, you're compliant, and you're not paying attention to your territories. Who benefits if you're too weak to run the family? Before Victor could answer, the heavy oak doors of the study burst open. Bruno rushed in, his face pale, gripping a suppressed handgun. "Boss," Bruno panted, locking the door behind him. "We have a breach. The perimeter alarms on the east wing just got cut. 3 armed men just bypassed the outer gate." Victor tried to push himself up in his wheelchair, but his arms trembled violently. The drugs in his system were pulling him under. He cursed, slamming a fist against the armrest. I can't see straight. Bruno, get my piece from the safe." "The safe is on a time lock, boss. It's past midnight." Bruno panicked. Gunfire popped in the distance, a muffled, terrifying sound echoing through the massive halls of the mansion. The rivals had chosen tonight to strike, knowing the Iron Ghost was incapacitated. Juliet's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of her son Leo, sleeping in his bed, miles away in Queens. She could not die here. She refused to leave her son an orphan. She grabbed the heavy iron fire poker from the fireplace. "Bruno." Juliet ordered, her voice cutting through the panic like a whip. "You take the door. Mr. Costello, get behind the mahogany desk. The wood is thickest there." Victor stared up at his overweight, underpaid assistant, wielding a fire poker like a broadsword, her eyes blazing with fierce maternal survival instinct. "You heard the woman," Victor growled to Bruno, fighting the heaviness in his eyelids. "Move!" The footsteps in the hallway grew louder. They were coming right for the study. The heavy oak doors of the study splintered inward with a deafening crash. Wood shards rained across the Persian rug as 2 men dressed in black tactical gear burst into the room, assault rifles raised. Bruno didn't hesitate. The hulking bodyguard fired twice, his suppressed weapon making a deadly thwip-thwip sound. The first intruder dropped instantly, a red bloom expanding across his chest. But the second attacker lunged forward, returning fire. A bullet grazed Bruno's shoulder, spinning the massive man around and sending him crashing into a glass display cabinet. Bruno. Juliet screamed, her maternal instincts completely overriding her fear. The remaining hitman swung his rifle toward Victor, who was still slumped behind the desk, fighting the heavy fog of the sedatives. The assassin sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. He never saw Juliet coming. Operating on pure, unadulterated adrenaline, Juliet stepped out from the shadows of the bookshelf. She gripped the heavy wrought-iron fire poker with both hands, raised it like a baseball bat, and brought it down with every ounce of her weight behind it. The iron bar cracked brutally against the hitman's kneecap. The man shrieked, his leg buckling instantly. As he collapsed forward, his rifle discharged harmlessly into the ceiling plaster. Before he could recover, Juliet swung again, bringing the heavy brass handle of the poker down on the back of his skull. The assassin crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Silence fell over the room, broken only by Bruno's ragged breathing and the ringing in Juliet's ears. She stood over the downed man, her chest heaving, the fire poker trembling in her grip. Victor leaned over his desk, his dark eyes wide, the lingering haze of the drugs temporarily burned away by the shock. He stared at his assistant, this curvy, exhausted single mother from Queens who had just taken down a cartel hitman with fireplace hardware. "Jenkins." Victor breathed out, his voice thick with disbelief. "Remind me never to mess with your son." Before they could catch their breath, a third set of footsteps echoed down the hall, moving rapidly in the opposite direction, away from the study toward the rear exit of the estate. "The alarms!" Juliet gasped, dropping the poker. Her mind raced, connecting the dots with the speed of a woman used to balancing a checkbook on pennies. Someone on the inside had to shut down the perimeter. The drugs, the timing, Clara! The nurse! Bruno grunted, clutching his bleeding shoulder as he struggled to his feet. She wouldn't have the guts. She's been poisoning him for weeks, Juliet insisted, her eyes flashing with fury. And she's making a run for it. Without waiting for permission, Juliet sprinted out of the study. She knew the sprawling layout of the Costello estate better than anyone. She had spent the last month organizing it. She bypassed the grand staircase and cut through the servants' corridor, her sensible thrift store shoes squeaking against the polished marble. She intercepted Clara in the mudroom near the garage. The slim, arrogant nurse was frantically stuffing bundles of cash and 2 leather-bound ledgers into a duffel bag. "Going somewhere, Clara?" Juliet asked, blocking the exit. Clara jumped, dropping a stack of hundreds. When she saw it was only Juliet, her panic morphed into an ugly sneer. "Get out of my way, you fat cow. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Dominic Rossi is taking over the Costello territory tonight. Victor is a cripple. He's finished." "He might be in a chair," Juliet said, stepping forward, her broad shoulders squared. "But he's 10 times the man Dominic Rossi is. And you're just a coward slipping pills into a disabled man's tea." Clara pulled a small silver revolver from her coat pocket, aiming it directly at Juliet's chest. "I said move. Your weight might stop a lot of things, sweetie, but it won't stop a bullet." Juliet looked at the gun. She thought of her 6-year-old Leo. She thought of the hospital bills, the eviction notices, the nights she cried herself to sleep, feeling completely powerless against a cruel world. She was done feeling powerless. "You're holding that safety catch wrong," Juliet bluffed smoothly, her voice completely deadpan. Clara instinctively glanced down at the gun. It was a split-second distraction, and it was all Juliet needed. With astonishing speed for her size, Juliet lunged. She didn't try to punch or kick. She simply used physics. She tackled Clara, throwing her entire heavy frame against the smaller woman. They crashed to the tile floor, the revolver skittering away under a bench. Clara screamed, thrashing and clawing, but she was trapped beneath Juliet's solid weight. Juliet pinned the nurse's arms down with her knees, glaring down at her, with the terrifying, unyielding wrath of a mother pushed to the brink. "I might be heavy," Juliet hissed, leaning in close, "but at least I'm not cheap." 10 minutes later, the estate was swarming with Costello loyalists. Bruno, his arm bandaged, rolled Victor into the mudroom where Juliet was casually sitting on a weeping Clara, waiting for the authorities Victor kept on his payroll. Victor looked at the stolen ledgers, the scattered cash, and the terrified traitor pinned beneath his assistant. He looked at Juliet, whose cheap blazer was torn, and hair was a messy, frizzy halo around her face. To everyone's shock, Victor Costello threw his head back and laughed. It was a deep, booming sound that echoed through the halls, a sound the mansion hadn't heard in 2 years. "Bruno," Victor chuckled, wiping a tear from his eye. "Double her salary." The cleanup of the Costello estate was swift, efficient, and brutally quiet. Dominic Rossi's hostile takeover failed spectacularly the moment Victor's trusted capos realized their boss was no longer incapacitated by Clara's slow, methodical poisoning. Once the sedative haze lifted, the Iron Ghost returned with a vengeance. Within 48 hours, the Rossi syndicate was systematically dismantled, and the freezing streets of New York quietly acknowledged that Victor Costello was back in absolute control. But inside the heavily fortified walls of the estate, the real shift in power had nothing to do with the Mafia. It had everything to do with Juliet. The morning after the attack, the air in the mansion still faintly smelled of bleach and cordite. Victor summoned Juliet to the sunroom. The harsh winter light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating his sharp features. The hollow, deadened look in his eyes was entirely gone. In its place was a burning, intense clarity that commanded the room. "Sit," Victor commanded, pointing a steady finger toward a plush velvet armchair opposite his wheelchair. Juliet, exhausted, bruised from tackling Clara and running on purely adrenaline and cheap instant coffee, sank into the chair with a heavy sigh. If you're going to fire me for physically assaulting your private nurse and ruining the mudroom floor, I'll need a severance package. Leo needs a new nebulizer, and my landlord is threatening eviction again. Victor stared at her for a long, unblinking moment. The silence stretched thick with unspoken tension. I ran a background check on you last night, a full invasive workup. Juliet stiffened, her maternal defensiveness flaring instantly. Excuse me, that's a massive invasion of privacy. You have no right to look into my son. You live in a dangerous, crumbling building in Queens. You're drowning in debt from Leo's hospital visits. You eat ramen for lunch in the break room so he can have fresh strawberries at dinner. Victor listed off his voice, lacking its usual abrasive edge. It was remarkably unsettlingly gentle. He reached into his blazer and slid a thick manila envelope across the glass coffee table. The debt is gone. The medical bills are paid. The landlord has been bought out. Permanently. Juliet stared at the thick envelope, her heart stopping in her chest. Her hands trembled as she reached out, hovering over the paper. Mr. Costello, I can't accept. You saved my life. Juliet. Victor interrupted his tone, brooking absolutely no argument. You saved my empire from crumbling into dust. But more than that, you woke me up. I spent 2 years wallowing in my own miserable pity, punishing everyone around me because I lost my legs. You walked in here carrying the weight of the entire world on your shoulders, and you didn't flinch. You didn't pity me. He wheeled himself closer, the electric motor humming quietly, until he stopped just inches from her knees. I don't want you living in Queens anymore. It's not safe. Rossi's surviving men might have seen your face, and I protect what is mine. I have a guest house on the East Lawn. It has 3 bedrooms, a private kitchen, a security detail, and a garden. I want you and Leo to move in by the weekend. Juliet swallowed hard, the immense relief finally cracking her stoic facade as tears pricked her eyes. Why are you doing this? Because, Victor said softly, reaching out to gently touch her bruised knuckles, his thumb grazing her skin. I need you to stay. The new arrangement moving to the Costello estate changed everything. Leo, a shy boy with big anxious eyes and a chronic wheeze, was initially terrified of the massive looming mansion and the armed guards patrolling the grounds. But Victor completely dismantled his own terrifying blood-soaked reputation for the sake of the 6-year-old boy. The ruthless Mafia boss installed a custom ramp in the Grand Library, not for his own accessibility, but so he could race remote-controlled cars with Leo on the polished hardwood floors. He hired the best pediatric pulmonologist in the state of New York, putting the doctor on an exorbitant retainer to visit the estate weekly. When Leo drew a messy, chaotic crayon picture of a wheelchair with massive flames on the wheels and handed it to the crime lord Victor, framed it in solid silver. He placed it squarely on his heavy oak desk, right next to his extortion ledgers and a loaded firearm. As the brutal winter thawed into a tentative blooming spring, the dynamic between Victor and Juliet evolved into something undeniable. Juliet was no longer just an assistant. She was his absolute confidant. She ran the legitimate fronts of the business with ruthless efficiency, her sharp mind catching financial discrepancies that even Victor's seasoned accountants missed. The gala and the glass slipper. But society's cruel conditioning is deeply ingrained, and money cannot instantly erase a lifetime of insecurities. One evening in late May, Victor hosted a lavish private gala at the estate for his highest-ranking associates to celebrate the syndicate's record-breaking quarter. Juliet attended wearing a beautiful flowing emerald green silk gown, that Victor had secretly had custom-tailored to her exact measurements. Despite the stunning dress and the flawless makeup, Juliet felt horribly exposed. Surrounded by the impossibly skinny, surgically enhanced wives of the capos, she felt her old demons creeping back. She stood near the champagne fountain, acutely aware of the space she took up. Then she caught snippets of hushed whispers from a group of women standing nearby. Look at her arms. Why does the boss keep her around? She's huge. I heard she used to be a temp. She looks more like a bouncer than a date. He must be keeping her out of pity. Humiliated, the familiar sting of lifelong mockery burned in Juliet's throat. She slipped away from the glittering ballroom, retreating to the humid, quiet sanctuary of the estate's sprawling conservatory, hiding among the towering ferns and blooming orchids. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, fighting back tears, feeling like an imposter in a world she didn't belong in. A few minutes later, the soft hum of electric wheels announced Victor's arrival. He navigated his chair through the dense foliage, his jaw clenched, his face set in a terrifying, murderous scowl. "I threw them out," Victor announced bluntly, his voice echoing in the glass room. Juliet wiped her eyes quickly, trying to feign composure. "Threw who out?" "Silvio, his wife, and the rest of their shallow entourage. I told Silvio if his wife ever disrespects my right hand again, I'll strip him of his territories and feed him to the Hudson." "Victor, no!" Juliet gasped, turning to him in alarm. "You can't alienate your best capos because of petty gossip. They're right, anyway. I don't fit in with them. I stick out like a sore thumb." "Good," Victor growled, wheeling himself closer until he could reach out and take her hands. "I don't want you to fit in with them. They are shallow, hollow parasites. You are real." "I'm fat, Victor," Juliet whispered, her voice breaking, as she finally voiced the deep-seated insecurity that had haunted her. "I'm a heavy, exhausted mother with stretch marks and a cheap background. I'm not Mafia royalty. I'm not what men like you want to show off." Victor looked up at her, his dark eyes blazing with an intensity that entirely stole her breath. He gently pulled her closer by her hands until she was standing between his knees, the emerald silk of her dress pooling around his chair. "Juliet, look at me," he commanded, his voice a low, vibrating rumble. She met his gaze, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "For 2 years I despised my own body." Victor confessed his words raw and stripped of all his usual armor. "I hated that it was broken. I hated that it couldn't do what it used to. I felt like half a man. But when I look at you, I don't see flaws. I see a body that has fought tooth and nail for survival. I see the soft curves that kept a sick child safe and warm when you had nothing. I see the immense physical strength that stepped between me and a cartel bullet without a second thought. Your body is a testament to your unrelenting power. It is magnificent and it is perfect." He reached up his calloused fingers, tracing the curve of her wide hip with incredible reverence, as if she were a priceless work of art. "You are the most beautiful, formidable woman I have ever known. You are my equal in every way, and I am entirely at your mercy." Juliet's breath hitched. For the first time in her 28 years, she wasn't being fetishized in secret, and she wasn't being insulted in public. She was being truly, completely seen and worshipped. She leaned down, closing the distance between them, and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was explosive, a collision of 2 unyielding forces. It held all the pent-up tension of the last 4 months, the fear, the survival, the quiet nights working by lamplight, the shared laughter over Leo's antics. Victor's strong arms wrapped securely around her thick waist, pulling her flush against him, grounding her in a way she had never experienced. The Empire redefined. By the time the leaves turned a brilliant fiery gold, the following autumn, the Costello syndicate was unrecognizable. It was stronger, wealthier, and entirely impenetrable. At the center of it all sat Victor Costello, the Iron Ghost, ruling from his chair with cold, calculated precision. But everyone in the underground, from the street soldiers to the international suppliers, knew the true law of the land. They knew that standing right beside the boss was Juliet Jenkins. Rule 1 of the Costello family: you do not steal from the boss. Rule 2 of the Costello family: you do not cross the boss's borders. Rule 3, the absolute undeniable law: you never under any circumstances show disrespect to the boss's queen or her son. She was no longer the desperate broke temp worker, begging for a daily bonus just to survive. Juliet was draped in custom silk that hugged every glorious curve of her body. She managed multi-million-dollar portfolios, stared down the most dangerous men in the city without blinking, and was always home in time to read Leo bedtime stories. She had walked into a cursed job facing down a monster who tried to break her. Instead, she broke down his walls, saved his entire empire, and claimed a throne of her own. No assistant had ever lasted a day working for Victor Costello. But Juliet wasn't an assistant. She was a mother, a survivor, and the absolute, undisputed love of his life. Did Juliet's fierce maternal instinct and unbreakable spirit leave you breathless? This story proves that true strength doesn't come from a size tag, but from a heart that refuses to quit. If you loved watching this curvy, unstoppable mother conquer a Mafia empire and find her true worth, like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own power, and subscribe for more.